Hello there, Boris. Sleepy. History here. In the history of Africa, there are empires that rose and fell like the desert winds, leaving traces in sand and stone and story. But there is one empire that, for a brief and brilliant time, dominated the western half of a continent with such power and sophistication that merchants from across the known world made their way to its cities, and scholars gathered in its universities, and warriors marched under its banners across lands so vast they seemed endless. This is the story of Songhai, a kingdom that transformed itself from a cluster of fishing villages on the banks of a great river into the largest imperial power West Africa had ever seen. It is a story written across water and sand, marked by patience and ambition, by faith and conquest, by the slow accumulation of wealth and knowledge over many centuries, until a small river kingdom became something far greater than anyone could have imagined at its beginning. Tonight, we will trace that rise from its earliest days when the ancestors of the Songhai were fishermen and hunters living along the middle reaches of the Niger River, through the long centuries when their city of Gao grew rich on the caravan trade, through the generations they spent in the shadow of the mighty Mali Empire, and finally into the extraordinary decades when two remarkable rulers, one a conqueror of almost superhuman reputation, and the other an administrator and reformer of rare vision, lifted Songhai beyond all its rivals. This is not a tale of sudden glory or accidents of fortune. It is the story of how geography, trade, military skill, religious transformation, and deliberate political choice combined, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, to create an empire that would reshape the destiny of West Africa. At its height, in the early years of the 16th century, the Songhai Empire stretched across well over 1,000,000 square kilometers of the western Sudan, from the salt mines of Tagaza deep in the Sahara Desert in the north, to the borderlands of the tropical forests in the south, from the regions near the Atlantic coast in the west, toward the lands of the Hausa city-states in the east, in what is now northern Nigeria. Millions of people, speaking many languages and following many faiths, lived within its borders. It was larger than the Ghana Empire had been at its height, larger even than Mali at its greatest extent, and by most reckonings it was the largest empire in the history of West Africa. Its cities were counted among the wonders of the age. Its ruler was known and honored in Cairo and in Mecca. Its scholars wrote books that would be treasured for centuries, and all of it grew from the waters of a single river, and from the people who understood that river better than anyone else alive. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the centuries unfold gently, one after another, like the slow current of the Niger itself. We begin, as the Songhai themselves began, with the river. The Niger River flows through the heart of West Africa like a lifeline, carrying water through a land that is by turns generous and merciless. To understand Songhai, one must first understand this river and the world it created. The Niger was not simply a source of water in an arid region, though it was certainly that. It was a highway, a larder, a fortress wall, and a teacher. It shaped everything about the societies that grew up along its banks, and it shaped the Songhai perhaps more deeply than any other people in the region. The Niger is one of the great rivers of the world, and one of the strangest. It rises in the highlands of Guinea, in hills that lie only a few hundred kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. Any reasonable river, one might think, would simply flow those few hundred kilometers west and empty into the sea. But the Niger does the opposite. It turns its back on the nearby ocean and flows northeast, away from the coast, deep into the interior of the continent, toward the edge of the Sahara Desert itself. For more than 1,000 kilometers it flows toward the desert, spreading out along the way into a vast inland delta of lakes and channels and floodplains in what is now central Mali. Then, as if realizing at last where it is headed, the river bends. Near the city of Gao, it curves in a great arc, the famous Niger Bend, and begins flowing southeast back toward the tropics, until finally, after a journey of more than 4,000 kilometers, it reaches the Atlantic Ocean through the mangrove swamps of what is now Nigeria. This strange looping course is the single most important geographical fact in the history of West Africa's great empires, because it means that the Niger carries fresh water, fertile soil, and easy transport right up to the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, to the exact place where the caravan routes from North Africa come down out of the sands. The river and the desert meet, and where they meet, wealth is created. Ghana rose near that meeting place, Mali rose along that river, and Songhai, in time, would rise there too, and would surpass them both. Along the river's middle reaches, where it flows through open savanna country, conditions were ideal for settlement. Each year, fed by rains falling far away in the Guinea highlands, the Niger swelled and overflowed its banks in a great seasonal flood. The flood was not a disaster, it was a gift, arriving with the reliability of the seasons themselves. The rising waters spread across the low ground on either side of the channel, and when they slowly withdrew, they left behind a layer of rich, moist soil in a land that otherwise received only modest rainfall. On that soil, farmers could grow rice in the wet ground near the river, and millet and sorghum on the higher land beyond. In the river itself, fish were abundant beyond counting, especially the great Nile perch, a fish that could grow longer than a man is tall. The floodplains fed herds of cattle in the dry season, and the water of the river itself, unlike the uncertain wells of the surrounding country, was fresh and reliable in every month of the year. Just as important, the river moved things. In a world before bridges and paved roads, before wheeled transport was practical across the soft sands and seasonal marshes of the Sahel, the river was faster than any caravan, safer than any desert crossing, and far cheaper than any overland route. A merchant could load several tons of grain, or salt, or cloth into a large canoe and move it hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. With a crew of only a few paddlers, a ruler could move soldiers and supplies along the water to any threatened point of his realm, and a kingdom that controlled the river could tax everything that moved along it, could deny passage to its enemies, and could bind distant towns together into a single connected world. The Niger was, in the truest sense, the road on which an empire could be built, and the river gave the year its shape. Life along the middle Niger moved and moves still, to a great slow rhythm of rising and falling water, and it is worth letting that rhythm settle into the mind, because every event in tonight's story, every harvest, every campaign, every caravan, kept time to it. The rains come to the Guinea highlands far to the southwest in the summer months, and the swollen headwaters begin their long journey down the channel. But the river is so long and so gentle in its gradient that the flood arrives at the middle Niger only months later, creeping northward and eastward through the inland delta like a slow tide, so that the driest months of the local year could be, strangely and wonderfully, the months of highest water, the river bringing the memory of distant rains into a rainless land. As the flow, odd, rose the world, changed. Lakes filled and joined, grasslands became fishing grounds. Villages that had stood beside the river now stood within it, on their mounds, and travel between them went by canoe. The fish spawned across the drowned plains in uncountable numbers. Then slowly, over months, the waters drew back, and as they withdrew, the people followed them out onto the wet land, planting rice and millet in the moist soil, pasturing cattle on the new grass of the emptied floodplain, harvesting the pools left behind, where fish crowded so thickly that whole villages worked side by side at the great seasonal catches. Low water was the season of movement and of war, when fords opened, when cavalry could operate, when the caravans timed their arrivals. High water was the season of the boatmen and the fleets. Every ruler in this story planned by that calendar, and every farmer lived by it, and beneath all the noise of dynasties it never changed. The river rose and fed its people, and fell and fed them again, year upon year upon year, the patient heartbeat under everything that follows. Long before there were kings or empires along the Niger, there were the peoples who learned to live from the river, and it is with them that the story of the Songhai truly begins. According to the traditions preserved by the Songhai themselves, and supported by the work of modern historians, the Songhai identity was formed, slowly and gradually, out of the merging of several older communities who lived along the eastern arc of the Niger Bend, in a region centered on an ancient town called Kukia, which lay on the river well to the southeast of Gao, near the modern border between Mali and Niger. The first of these communities were the Soko, the masters of the water. The Soko were fishermen and boatmen who built swift canoes and larger vessels from the wood of the Sai cedrat tree, and who made their living from the river itself. They fished with nets and lines and harpoons. They hunted the hippopotamus and the crocodile, dangerous work that earned them great prestige, and they carried goods and passengers up and down the river, becoming the transporters and ferrymen of the whole region. The Soko knew the Niger in all its moods, its channels and sandbanks, its floods and its shallows, and their knowledge of the water would remain at the heart of Songhai power for as long as the empire lasted. Alongside the Soko lived the Gao, who were hunters of the land rather than the water, pursuing the game of the savannah, and the Do, who were farmers, cultivating the fertile soils left behind by the annual flood. Over many generations, these river folk, hunters and farmers traded with one another, intermarried, and gradually blended together. At some point in the distant past, they came to be dominated by, or absorbed together with, groups of Songhai-speaking people, and out of this long mingling emerged a single people with a shared language and a shared homeland along the river, the Songhai. Their language became the common tongue of the eastern Niger Bend, and it remains so to this day, spoken by millions of people in modern Mali and Niger, a living inheritance from the world we are describing. Tonight, it is worth pausing to appreciate how deep the roots of this story reach. Archaeologists working at Gao and at nearby sites have found evidence of organized settlement going back well over 1,000 years before the empire's golden age. The Songhai were not newcomers who conquered a land they did not know. They were, in the most literal sense, at home. They had buried their ancestors in that soil for centuries. They knew which channels of the river could be crossed in which season, which pastures flooded and which stayed dry, where the fish gathered and where the caravans watered their camels. This intimate, inherited knowledge of one place is a quiet kind of power, less dramatic than armies or gold, but in the long run, just as important. Empires built by strangers tend to pass quickly. The empire the Songhai would eventually build grew out of a homeland they had inhabited beyond the reach of memory. In the midst of this river world, two towns mattered above all others in the early centuries: Kukia and Gao. Kukia, the older of the two, was the ancestral heart of the Songhai people, a river town whose name would always carry a sense of origin and legitimacy, the way certain ancient cities do in the traditions of many peoples. Gao lay downstream to the northwest, at the eastern end of the Great Bend, and Gao had something Kukia did not, a perfect position for trade. For Gao sat at the meeting point of two worlds. From the north came the caravan trails across the Sahara, descending from the oases of the desert towards the water. From the south and west came the river itself, connecting Gao to the inland delta, to the gold fields beyond, and to all the towns of the Niger. Whoever held Gao stood at the crossroads where desert met river, where salt met gold, where North Africa met the lands of the Sudan, which is the old Arabic name, Bilad el-Sudan, the land of the black peoples, for the great belt of savanna country south of the Sahara. By roughly the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, Gao, known to Arab geographers of the time as Kokor, had grown into one of the most important trading towns in all of West Africa. We know this not only from tradition, but from the written record, because Arab travelers and geographers writing in distant cities began to mention it. As early as the 9th century, the geographer al-Yaqubi described Kokor as one of the greatest and most powerful kingdoms of the Sudan, to which other kingdoms paid obedience. A century later, another writer, al-Muhalabi, described a prosperous royal town on the Niger with a king, a court, and busy markets. And in the year 1068, the great Andalusian geographer al-Bakri, gathering reports from merchants who had made the desert crossing, described Gao as a city in two parts, one the town of the king, and one the town of the Muslim merchants, a detail that tells us the trans-Saharan trade was already so well established that foreign traders lived there permanently, in their own quarter, generation after generation. Al-Bakri, that careful gatherer of merchants' reports, preserved something even more intimate than the shape of the city, a glimpse of the royal court of Gao itself as it appeared to visitors nearly 1,000 years ago. He recorded that when the king of Kokor sat down to his meal, a drum was beaten to announce it, and the women of the town danced, and no one in the city conducted any business until the king had finished eating. And when the royal meal was done, the remains of it were carried out and cast into the river, and the courtiers cried out to let the whole town know that the king had eaten. He recorded, too, that the kingship was conferred with regalia of deep significance, a signet ring, a sword, and a copy of the Quran, which tradition at the court held to have been sent long before from the Caliph in the east, a claim that shows how early the kings of Gao had begun weaving their local majesty together with the prestige of the wider Islamic world. and he noted the balance at the heart of the kingdom in his day. The king was a Muslim, for only a Muslim could hold the kingship, and yet the customs of the court, the drum, the dance, the offerings to the river, breathed the older world of the Songhai. Reading al-Bakri, one can almost hear that drum sounding across the water at midday, in a city that would not reach the height of its fame for another 500 years. These early written glimpses are precious, because they show us that Gao's rise was not sudden. For century after patient century, the town grew. A fishing settlement, then a market, then a royal town, then a city known by name to scholars writing in Baghdad and Cordoba. Wealth accumulated slowly, like silt deposited by the river's annual flood, and with wealth came power. Over this early kingdom of Gao ruled a line of kings remembered as the Zhar dynasty, sometimes written as Zuwa or Dia in different traditions. Much of what we know about the Zhar comes from two remarkable chronicles written centuries later in Timbuktu in the 1600s by West African scholars writing in Arabic. The Tarikh al-Sudan, the Chronicle of the Sudan, composed by Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, and the Tarikh al-Fatash, the Chronicle of the Sikha. These chronicles preserved the oral traditions and the older records of the region, and they remain, together with the accounts of Arab geographers and the findings of modern archaeology, our most important sources, our real historical foundations for the whole story of Songhai. According to the Tarikh al-Sudan, the founder of the Zhar dynasty was a figure remembered as Zhar al-Yaman, a name the chronicle explains as meaning, "he who has come from Yemen." The legend tells that this stranger arrived long ago at Kukia, where the people were troubled by a monstrous fish, or a river demon in the shape of a fish, that tyrannized them from the water. Zhar al-Yaman killed the great fish with an iron spear, and the grateful people made him their king. Now, historians do not treat this tale as literal fact. Origin stories that trace a royal line to a prestigious stranger from the East are common in the traditions of many West African dynasties, and the tale of the fish is best understood as legend, a story that expressed the special bond between Songhai kingship and the river. Boom! Behind the legend stands a real line of kings. The chronicle lists more than 30 rulers of the Zhar dynasty, most of them little more than names, ruling first from Kukia and later from Gao across a span of centuries. For the first 14 of these kings, the chronicle says, the old religion of the land prevailed, the traditional faith of the Songhai, with its reverence for the spirits of the river, the ancestors, and the unseen forces that governed harvest and flood. Then, in the year 1009 or 1010 of the Common Era, a change came that would echo through the rest of Songhai history. The 15th ruler of the line, remembered as Zhar Kusoi, accepted Islam, becoming the first Muslim king of Gao. The chronicle notes, with evident approval, that he did so of his own free will, without coercion, and tradition connects his reign with the shifting of the royal seat from Old Kukia to the trading city of Gao. Zhar Kusoi's conversion did not transform his kingdom overnight, and it is important to understand what it did and did not mean. The geographer al-Bakri, writing about 60 years later, recorded that while the king of Gao was a Muslim, most of his people still followed their traditional religion. This pattern, a Muslim king ruling a largely non-Muslim population with the two faiths living side by side, would remain characteristic of the region for hundreds of years, and we will meet it again and again in this story. For the kings of Gao, Islam was many things at once. It was, for some of them at least, a matter of sincere personal faith. But it was also a bridge to the wider world. The merchants who came across the desert were Muslims. The law they used in their contracts, the script they used in their letters, the credit networks that stretched from Gao to Sijilmasa to Cairo, all of these were part of the Islamic world. A Muslim king could deal with these merchants as a brother in faith. His envoys could travel and be received with honor. His city became a more attractive and trustworthy destination for the caravans. In embracing Islam, the rulers of Gao were joining what was, in that age, the largest and most sophisticated commercial and intellectual network on earth, a network stretching from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the islands of Southeast Asia. Modern archaeology has given us a hauntingly direct confirmation of this early Muslim kingdom on the Niger. At a burial ground called Gao Sene, just outside the modern city, excavators have found royal tombstones carved with Arabic inscriptions, the oldest dating from the 11th and 12th centuries. Some of these stones, beautifully carved, appear to have been made from marble quarried in faraway Spain, in the region of Almeria, and carried across the desert by caravan. Tombstones ordered from workshops thousands of kilometers away, for kings and queens who died on the banks of the Niger 900 years ago. Their titles are recorded in the stone: Malik, king, and Malika, queen. We know some of their names and the very years and days of their deaths from these stones. Think of that for a moment as you rest. The names of individual rulers of Gao, preserved letter by letter in Spanish marble under the Sahel sky for nearly 1,000 years. History here is not a vague mist. It is carved, dated, and still standing in the sand. To understand why Gao mattered so much, and why so many powers would compete to control the Niger Bend over the centuries, we must now speak of the two substances that drove the economy of this entire world: gold and salt. These were the twin engines of the trans-Saharan trade, and they shaped everything that follows in our story. Gold came from the south. In the forests and river valleys of the upper Niger and Senegal river systems, in regions the merchants called Bambouk and Bure, and further south toward the Akan forests, gold could be washed from riverbeds and dug from shallow pits. The mining itself was done by local peoples who guarded the secrets of their gold fields jealously and who traded the metal northward through networks of African merchants, the most famous of whom were the Wangara, also known as the Dayula, Mandi-speaking traders, whose family networks stretched across the whole of West Africa. The gold moved north from hand to hand, from the forest edge to the savannah markets, and finally to the great river cities, to Jenne, to Timbuktu, to Gao, where it met the caravans of the desert, and the caravans in turn brought salt. It can be difficult in the modern world to feel the true value that salt once held, but consider what salt meant in the West African savannah. The human body must have salt to live, and in a hot land where farmers and fishermen and soldiers sweated through their labor every day of the year, the need was constant. Yet the savannah and forest zones had almost no natural salt of their own. What little could be produced locally from plant ashes or poor earth was inferior and scarce. The great deposits of pure rock salt lay far to the north, In the most desolate reaches of the Sahara Desert, at places like Taghaza, hundreds of kilometers from anywhere, where salt lay in thick beds beneath the surface, the remains of ancient dried lakes. At Taghaza, enslaved workers and desert laborers cut the salt into great slabs, each weighing about as much as a grown person could lift, and the slabs were loaded to a camel for the long journey south. Travelers who visited Tagaza described a place of almost unearthly strangeness, a settlement with virtually no water and no crops, where even the buildings, walls and mosque alike were constructed from blocks of salt, and everything the inhabitants ate had to be carried in across the desert. It was said that in the markets of the south, salt could at times be exchanged for its weight in gold. Modern historians treat that famous claim carefully, as a report of exceptional moments rather than an everyday exchange rate, but it captures a real truth. In the land south of the desert, salt was wealth, health, and life itself. So the fundamental exchange of this world was set. Northern salt for southern gold, moving in opposite directions along the same routes, and meeting in the middle at the cities of the Niger. But the trade was never only salt and gold. The caravans coming south carried fine cloth from North Africa and Egypt, copper and brass, glassware and beads, dates and figs, swords and armor, books and paper, and above all horses, the powerful Barbary horses of the Maghreb, which could not be bred easily in the south, and which every Sudanic king desired for his cavalry. Going north, alongside the gold, travelled ivory, ostrich feathers, fine leather goods that Europe would later know as Moroccan leather, though much of it originated in the Sudan, kola nuts from the southern forests, prized throughout the Sahel as a stimulant and a gesture of hospitality, and it must be said honestly, enslaved human beings, captives of war and raiding, who were marched across the desert to the markets of North Africa. The slave trade was a grim and constant thread in the commerce of this age, as it was in most of the ancient and medieval world, and no truthful account of these empires can leave it out. Wealth in the Sudan was measured in gold, in cattle, and in people, and the power of kings rested partly on their command of unfree labor. We will return to this reality later, gently but honestly, because history asks us to see the past whole. Within the cities, this vast trade ran on trust, credit, and small change, and the small change of the Niger world was one of its most charming features. Cowrie shells. These small, glossy white shells were harvested in the Indian Ocean, in the islands of the Maldives, and traveled by ship and caravan across half the world to serve as everyday currency in the markets of West Africa. A traveler in the 14th century recorded that purchases in the river cities were made with cowries, and so they would be for centuries afterward. Gold for the great transactions, cowries for the fish, the millet, and the firewood of daily life. Imagine for a moment the journey of a single small shell, gathered by a diver in the warm shallows of the Maldives, sold to an Arab merchant, carried up the Red Sea, across Egypt, along the North African coast, southward over the Sahara by camel, to be spent at last in a riverside market in Gao by a Sorko fisherman's wife buying a measure of rice. The world of the Middle Ages was more connected than we often imagine, and the Niger cities sat firmly inside that web of connection. Before we go on, let us honor the tremendous human effort that lay behind every grain of that trade, and take one journey ourselves in imagination with a caravan crossing the great desert, for without the crossing, none of this story happens. and few undertakings in the history of commerce have ever demanded more of the people who made them. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, a sea of sand, gravel, and bare rock, stretching some 1,500 kilometers and more between the settled lands of North Africa and the cities of the Niger. For most of human history, it was simply impassable in any organized way until the arrival, in the early centuries of the Common Era, of the animal that changed everything: the camel. The one-humped dromedary, introduced into North Africa from the east, could carry loads of well over 100 kilograms, could travel for a week and more without drinking, could eat the thorny scrub that no other beast of burden would touch, and could walk on soft sand that broke the legs and hearts of horses and oxen. The camel made the desert crossable, and the peoples of the desert, above all, he Berber-speaking nomads whom history knows as the Tuareg and the Samhaja, made themselves its masters, breeding the animals, knowing the wells, and serving for a price as guides, guards, and sometimes as raiders of the very caravans they escorted. A great trading caravan of this age was less like a company of merchants and more like a moving town. The largest could number hundreds and even thousands of camels, with their drivers, guards, guides, merchants, servants, and enslaved travelers, organized under a caravan leader whose word on the road was law, for in the desert, discipline was survival. Caravans gathered at the ports of the desert's northern shore, at towns like Sijil Masa in southern Morocco, the golden gateway of the western routes, where goods from Fez and the Mediterranean were repacked. Camels bought and rested, and guides engaged. Then, usually in the cooler months of the year, the caravan committed itself to the sands. The routine of the road was ancient and exact. The caravan moved in the relative cool, often starting before dawn, resting through the killing heat of midday where any shade could be found, and marching again into the evening. In the worst stretches, travelers moved at night, steering as sailors did by the stars, and the great guides of the desert were famous for being able to navigate by the feel and smell of the sand itself. Some of the most celebrated of them, it was said, even after they had gone blind. The stages of the journey were measured from well to well, and the wells were everything. Some were sweet, some barely drinkable, some found half buried and had to be dug out. And between certain wells lay marches of many days where no water existed at all, stretches with names that travelers spoke with respect, where the bones of camels from 100 earlier caravans marked the trail more reliably than any signpost. The dangers were constant and impersonal: sandstorms that could bury a camp and erase the track, heat that could kill a strong man in a day if the water failed, the slower miseries of thirst rationed by the cupful, and the human dangers raiders watching from the dunes for a caravan too weak or too rich. Travelers' accounts tell of caravans that missed a well and perished almost entire, and every merchant who set out knew such stories by heart. The crossing from the Maghreb to the Niger took, in the ordinary way of things, around 2 months, sometimes more. 2 months of walking at the pace of a laden camel through the emptiest landscape on earth, for profit at the far side. And yet they came, year after year, century after century, in such numbers that the routes became institutions, as regular in their season as the flood of the river. The rhythm of the great salt caravans in particular settled into a pattern that endured into living memory. Out from the river cities to the mines with goods and provisions, back from the mines with the slabs of salt, The whole cycle timed to the seasons and awaited at both ends like a harvest. When at last a southbound caravan reached the well of Timbuktu or the harbour of Gao, the arrival was an event for the whole city. The long line of camels swaying in from the northern horizon, the dust and the shouting and the smell of the desert on everything, the merchants of the town crowding out to learn the news of the world. What Ray Ould in Fez? What was the price of gold in Cairo? Who had died? Who reigned? What the learned were reading, for the caravans carried information as surely as they carried cloth, and the cities of the Niger, which can look isolated on a modern map, were in truth connected by these slow, brave, regular voyages of the sand to the whole breadth of the old world. When we say then that Gao grew rich at the meeting place of desert and river, let us hear inside that quiet phrase the groan of 10,000 kneeling camels and the blistered feet of the guides, and the prayers said at the last well before the long dry marches, and the joy every trading season for 700 years of arrival. Now a trade this valuable does not go unnoticed by powerful neighbours, and for much of its early history, the kingdom of Gao lived not as a master of this world, but as a junior participant in it, overshadowed by greater empires to the west. The first of these was Ghana, the earliest of the great Sudanic empires, which rose far to the west of the Niger Bend, in the lands between the Senegal and Niger rivers, and dominated the western ends of the caravan trade from roughly the 8th to the 11th centuries. Ghana's example mattered enormously, for it demonstrated the model that all its successors would follow: control the meeting points of desert and savanna, tax the trade in gold and salt, use the wealth to maintain cavalry and to reward loyalty, and rule a federation of subject people. See. Through a combination of force, prestige, and mutual benefit. Gao, in Ghana's era, was a parallel power on the eastern end of the trade routes, prosperous but regional. It was the second great empire, Mali, that would draw Gao fully into its orbit. Mali arose in the 13th century among the Mand-speaking peoples of the Upper Niger, founded, according to the great oral epics, by the hero Sundiata Keita, after his victory over the Soso around the year 1235. Mali was built on the same foundations as Ghana, gold and salt and cavalry, but on a far grander scale, for Mali controlled the goldfields themselves more directly, and its territory eventually stretched from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the interior. In the first decades of the 1300s, Mali's power reached the Niger Bend, and Gao, wealthy and strategically placed, was absorbed into the Malian Empire, most likely around the year 1325. One account, preserved by the historian Ibn Khaldun, credits the conquest to a Malian general named Sakmanja. The chronicles of Timbuktu record that the Emperor of Mali received the submission of Gao while returning from his pilgrimage. However it happened in detail, the result was clear. The Songhai kingdom of Gao became a province of Mali, and its wealth began flowing westward to enrich the treasury of the Malian emperors. That emperor, at the moment of Gao's annexation, was the most famous ruler in all of West African history, Mansa Musa. In the years 1324 and 1325, Mansa Musa made his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca, crossing the desert with a retinue of thousands, and spending gold in Cairo with such astonishing generosity that, according to accounts written in Egypt, the value of gold in the city was depressed for years afterward. The fame of that pilgrimage spread across the Islamic world and even into Europe, where map makers began drawing the Emperor of Mali, seated on a golden throne at the edge of their maps of Africa, holding up a nugget of gold. Mansa Musa matters to our story for two reasons. First, because his empire now ruled the Songhai, and the memory of his pilgrim age would set the standard that a later Songhai emperor would consciously strive to equal and surpass. And second, because on his return journey, Mansa Musa passed through the cities of the Niger Bend and lavished attention upon them, most famously upon Timbuktu, where he is credited with commissioning the great Jingeraba Mosque, built under the direction of an architect and poet from Granada named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whom the emperor had persuaded to return with him from the east. Under Mali's protection, Timbuktu began its climb toward greatness as a center of trade and learning, a greatness that Songhai would one day inherit. What was life like in the Songhai lands under Malian rule? For a vivid answer, we are lucky to have the testimony of one of the greatest travelers who ever lived. In the year 1353, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, who had spent nearly 30 years journeying across Africa and Asia from Morocco to China, visited the Niger Bend on the final great journey of his life. He came down the river by boat from Timbuktu, and he described Gao, which he called Koko, as one of the finest, biggest, and most fertile cities of the Sudan, rich in rice and milk, in chickens and fish, and in a variety of cucumber he found particularly delightful. He noted that the people of the city conducted their buying and selling with cowrie shells, and he stayed a month before joining a caravan north across the desert. His portrait is precious, a great, well-fed, orderly river city, prosperous under Malian rule, its markets humming, its religious life active. The Songhai were not suffering under Mali, but they were not free either, and the wealth of their river was, in the end, another people's wealth. The traditions of the Songhai preserve a story about the beginning of the long road back to independence, and it centers on a prince named Ali Koloun, also remembered as Ali Golum. According to the chronicles, Ali Koloun was a son of the Songhai royal line who, like other princes of subject peoples, was required to serve at the court of the Emperor of Mali, partly as an honor and partly, in truth, as a hostage for his people's good behavior. The story tells that Ali Koloun served with distinction, learned the ways of Malian power from the inside, and quietly prepared his escape, staging supplies along the road home. At last he fled the court with his brother, pursued by Malian riders, and fought his way back to the Songhai country, where he raised the banner of rebellion and founded a new royal line, the Sunni dynasty, sometimes written Sunni or Si. Historians debate the dating of these events, placing Ali Koloun somewhere between the late 1200s and the late 1300s, and they caution that the tale has surely been polished in the telling, but the outline it preserves is credible and revealing. Songhai independence began not with a single glorious battle, but with resistance, escape, and a long, stubborn refusal to remain a province forever. The rebellion of Ali Koloun did not immediately free the Songhai heartland, and for generations the Sunni rulers seem to have governed from the south, perhaps from old Kukia, while Mali still held Gao and the river cities. But time was on their side, because the giant that ruled them was slowly weakening. Through the late 1300s, the Mali Empire was troubled by exactly the sickness that afflicts so many great states: disputed successions. Emperor followed emperor in quick and sometimes violent succession. Factions fought at court, and the energy of the state turned inward. Rebellions flared at the edges of the empire, among them a rising at Gao itself in the 1370s that Mali struggled to suppress. Tuareg nomads from the desert pressed down upon the northern cities, and in the 1430s, the pressure told at last. Mali's garrisons withdrew from the Niger Bend. The Tuareg seized Timbuktu in 1433, and the Songhai, under their Sonny kings, stood fully independent once more, masters of Gao and of their ancestral river. An independent kingdom, however, is not yet an empire, and in the middle of the 1400s, Songhai was still only one power among several in a fragmented land. The Tuareg held Timbuktu and the desert approaches. The trading city of Djenné, far to the southwest in the inland delta, was proudly self-governing. Mali, though diminished, still ruled great territories in the west. The Mossi kingdoms south of the river Bend were strong and aggressive, sending cavalry raids northward. It was a landscape of rivals, and it awaited a hand strong enough to gather it together. In the 1460s, the Sonny king Suleiman Dama gave a first sign of what was coming when he led a Songhai attack westward against Mema, a province of the old Malian sphere, demonstrating that Songhai could now prefer direct power far beyond its home territory. But Suleiman Dama died soon after, and the throne passed, in or around the year 1464, to the man who would change everything, his successor, remembered as Sunni Ali, and by his own people as Ali Bur, which means Ali the Great. Few rulers in African history have left behind so vivid and so divided a memory as Sunni Ali. To the scholars of Timbuktu, writing generations after his death, he was a tyrant, capricious, violent, and impious, and their chronicles record his cruelties in bitter detail. But to the Songhai people themselves, in the oral traditions passed down by the griots, the hereditary bards and historians of West Africa, he was and remains a hero of almost supernatural stature, a warrior king and a master of hidden powers, a magician who could not be defeated. Between these two portraits, the outraged chronicle and the admiring epic, modern historians steer a careful course, and the figure who emerges is one of the most formidable conquerors of the 15th century world. Sunni Ali was born the son of Sunni Muhammad Dao, a previous king of the line, and according to tradition, of a mother from the region of Farah, a land where the old religion of the Songhai remained strong. He was raised, the traditions say, in his mother's country, schooled in the traditional spiritual arts of the Songhai, as well as receiving an Islamic education, and this double inheritance marked him for life. As king, Sunni Ali prayed the Muslim prayers and kept the fast of Ramadan, but he also honored the spirits of the river and the ancestors, kept the company of the traditional priests and magicians, and never allowed Islamic law to override his own royal will. The Muslim scholars of the cities regarded his religion as shallow and mixed, and they were not wrong that it was mixed. But they perhaps missed what it meant. Sunni Ali was a king of two worlds, the world of the mosque and the world of the river spirits, and his authority drew strength from both. To the farmers and fishermen of the countryside, he was one of their own, a king in the ancient mold. It was a large part of why they followed him so far. When Sunni Ali took the throne around 1464, he inherited a compact, seasoned kingdom controlling the Niger from the Dendi country in the southeast up through Gao, and he inherited pressing dangers on every side. He answered those dangers with a policy that can be stated in a single word: attack. For the next 28 years, Sunni Ali was almost constantly at war, campaigning up and down the river and across the surrounding lands, and the chronicles record the astonishing claim, repeated by the historians of Timbuktu who otherwise had no love for him, that he fought throughout his reign without ever suffering a decisive defeat. Tradition counts his campaigns in the dozens and his victories in every one of them. Whatever allowance we make for the exaggeration that gathers around such figures, the map does not lie. At his accession, Songhai was a kingdom. At his death, it was the master of the entire Middle Niger. His first great prize was Timbuktu. The city's situation in the 1460s was unhappy. Since the Malian withdrawal, Timbuktu had been under the domination of the Tuareg, the veiled nomads of the desert, whose chief, Akil, taxed the city heavily while offering little protection or governance in return. The city's own leading men chafed under this arrangement, and around 1468, the governor of the city, exasperated with Tuareg exactions, sent word to Sunni Ali, inviting him to come and take Timbuktu. Sunni Ali came. The Tuareg, who were raiders rather than defenders of cities, withdrew into the desert rather than face his army, and in 1468 or early in 1469 by some reckonings, Sunni Ali entered Timbuktu. What followed left a lasting scar in the memory of the city. Expecting perhaps an orderly transfer of power, Timbuktu instead experienced a sack. The chronicler al-Sadi, writing in the Tarikh al-Sudan, recorded with anguish that Sunni Ali committed gross iniquity in the city, burning and destroying and dealing brutally with many of its people. His particular anger fell upon the scholarly class of the Sankore quarter, the jurists and teachers whom he regarded, not entirely without reason, as allies and kinsmen of the Tuareg lords who had just fled. Warned of his coming, a great part of the learned community had already escaped. Tradition tells that 1,000 camels were assembled to carry the scholars of Sankore westward to the desert town of Walata, an image that has echoed down the centuries, a whole university in flight across the sands. Those scholars who remained faced persecution, and some were killed. It was this episode, above all, that fixed Sunni Ali's dark reputation in the writings of the learned, for in the Islamic world few crimes carried a deeper stain than violence against men of learning. Yet even here the record is not simple. In later years, Sunni Ali softened toward Timbuktu scholars. The chronicles themselves admit that he showed favor and generosity to certain jurists, and the city remained, throughout his reign, within his empire and under his peace. He wanted Timbuktu's wealth and obedience, not its destruction. If Timbuktu fell in a season, his next target resisted for years. Far to the southwest in the watery maze of the inland delta where the Niger and its sister river the Bani intertwine among marshes and seasonal lakes, stood the city of Djenné, one of the oldest urban places in all of sub-Saharan Africa, heir to a settlement, Djenné, whose archaeological remains reach back more than 2,000 years. Djenné was the southern gateway of the whole trading system, the market where the gold and kola of the forests met the salt and cloth of the north, and it was superbly defensible, ringed by water for much of the year, approachable only by channels its defenders knew far better than any attacker. Djenné had never been taken by siege. Its people boasted that even mighty Mali had failed against it many times. Sunni Ali, arriving with his army and his war fleet, settled down to prove them wrong. The struggle that followed became legendary. Tradition, as recorded in the chronicles, tells that the siege of Jenne lasted 7 years, the Songhai fleet blockading the waterways season after season, the army camping and campaigning and returning, slowly strangling the city's trade and food supply. Modern historians note that the 7-year figure comes from tradition and may have grown in the telling, but the essential story is well attested. Jenne could not be stormed, so it was patiently starved, and in the end, around the year 1473, the exhausted city yielded. And then, the traditions say, something unexpected happened. Sunni Ali, so merciless at Timbuktu, treated Jenne with honor. Impressed by the courage of its long defense, he spared the city, confirmed its young ruler in his position, and, according to a beloved tradition, sealed the peace by marrying the ruler's widowed mother. Jenne entered the empire not as a broken conquest, but almost as an ally, and it would remain one of the brightest jewels of Songhai for a century. With Gao, Timbuktu, and Jenne, the three great cities of the Niger, under one authority for the first time in a generation, Sunni Ali had already redrawn the map of West Africa. But his wars did not stop. To the south, he faced the most dangerous of his neighbors, the mossy kingdoms of the Volta country, whose superb cavalry had a long habit of riding north to raid the wealth of the riverlands. Around the year 1480, a great mossy expedition under their king, whom the chronicles call Nasser, struck deeper into the Sahelian world than any mossy force had ever reached, driving northwest past the river country all the way to the ancient desert-edge city of Walata, which they besieged, took, and plundered, carrying off captives and booty before turning for home. It was an astonishing feat of long-range raiding and a direct challenge to the new master of the region. For Walata lay within the world Songhai claimed to protect. Sunni Ali's answer came in the following years. He brought the Mossi to battle as they campaigned again, and inflicted upon them, in the early 1480s, a defeat severe enough that the Mossi threat to the riverlands was broken for the remainder of his reign. His successor would carry the war onward into the Mossi homelands themselves. The chroniclers, ever reluctant to praise him, recorded the victories all the same, and the lesson they taught the whole region was unmistakable. The age when horsemen could ride out of the south and take what they wished from the cities of the Niger was over. There was an emperor on the river now. To the west and southwest he campaigned against the Fulani of Messina, cattle-herding people whose migrations and raids troubled the delta, and the hill-dwelling Dogon of the Bandiagra country, and against the remnants of Malian power, pushing Songhai authority westward along the river. To the north, he held the desert edge against the Tuareg, keeping the caravan ports of the Niger under his hand. Some campaigns were harsh, and the chronicles record cruelties against the Fulani in particular that make somber reading. It was conquest with all that conquest means, and it is right to remember that beneath the sweep of empire building lay burned villages and grieving families, as it has in the building of empires on every continent and in every age. What made this quarter-century of unbroken victory possible? Part of the answer was Sunni Ali himself, a commander of genuine brilliance, fast-moving, unpredictable, and relentless, who campaigned in person year after year and struck, the traditions say, like lightning, appearing where no enemy expected him. But the deeper answer was the military machine he built. the finest West Africa had yet seen, organized around the great fact of the river. Its heart was the fleet. Sunni Ali expanded the war flotilla of the Songhai into a force tradition numbers in the hundreds of great canoes, crewed by the Soko boatmen whose ancestors had mastered the Niger 1,000 years before, and commanded by an admiral bearing the old title of High Khoi, master of the boats. With the fleet, Sunni Ali could move soldiers and supplies faster than any enemy could march, could blockade a river city like Jenne, could throw troops across the water where no ford existed, and could patrol 2,000 kilometers of river against pirates and rebels. No other power in the region had anything like it. Around the fleet he organized the army, a striking force of armored cavalry, the aristocratic arm of Sudanic warfare, mounted on horses brought south by the caravan trade and protected by quilted armor and iron, and masses of infantry armed with spear and bow, raised from the subject peoples of the empire. Later tradition put the strength of the imperial forces at 30,000 foot and 10,000 horse. The figures are traditional and should be heard as meaning simply a very great host, but there is no doubt that Songhai could put into the field an army larger and better organized than any rivals. Sunni Ali was also more than a destroyer. He was a builder, in ways that his hostile chroniclers acknowledged almost despite themselves. He grasped, as clearly as any ruler of his age, that his empire was the river, and he undertook works to extend the river's reach. He is credited with digging and improving channels and dikes to aid irrigation and navigation, and with one project of breathtaking ambition, a canal, begun in the 1480s, that was to run northwest from the region of Ras El Mar at the western end of Lake Faguibin toward the desert city of Walata, so that his fleet and his commerce could reach a place that stood far from any natural waterway. The canal was never finished. Word came that the Mossi had invaded, and the army marched away to war, leaving the great trench unfinished in the earth, where traces of such old workings can still be pointed out. But the vision behind it, of an empire knit together by water, by engineered geography, tells us how this king thought. He organized his conquests as provinces under appointed governors, chose commanders and administrators for loyalty and ability, settled communities of captives on royal estates to grow food for the army, and left to his successors not merely a swollen territory, but the working skeleton of a state. For all this, his relations with the Muslim establishment of his cities remained tense to the end. Sunni Ali would not be ruled by the scholars, taxed and disciplined them when they crossed him, and kept the old faith of the countryside alive at the heart of his court. The learned men of Timbuktu repaid him in the coin they controlled, the written word, and their chronicles called him the great oppressor, a master of tyranny, unmatched in his age for violence, while conceding in the same breath his energy, his generosity when pleased, and his unending victories. Perhaps the fairest summary is the one implied by the empire itself. The peoples of the river, most of whom were not scholars, followed him for 28 years, and under his hand their world became larger, safer from outside raiders, and incomparably more powerful than it had ever been. The end came in the autumn of 1492, a year in which, far away across the Atlantic, other events were unfolding that would one day transform Africa's destiny too. Sunni Ali was returning from a campaign in the South Country against the Fulani when, according to the account preserved in the chronicles, he was drowned while crossing a flooding seasonal river, swept away with the suddenness that the waters of that land can show. So the master of the Niger was taken in the end by water. The traditions of the Songhai, unwilling to let so mighty a figure die so arbitrary a death, told other stories, whispering that he had been betrayed, and his memory passed into legend, where he lives still in the epics of the griots as the sorcerer king, the unconquered Ali Bur Ali the Great. He had reigned 28 years from 1464 to 1492, and he left behind him the largest state West Africa had ever seen, and a succession that would be decided within months by one of the great political struggles of African history. Sunni Ali was succeeded in the first instance by his son, who took the throne as Sunni Baru. The army commanders proclaimed him king in the traditional way, and had matters rested on custom and descent alone, the Sunni dynasty might have ruled for generations more. But beneath the surface of the empire his father had built, a deep question had been left unanswered, and it now rose to the surface with irresistible force. What kind of state was Songhai to be? Was it to remain what Sunni Ali had made it, a river empire in the ancient Songhai mold, where the king stood above all faiths and drew his power from the old spirits as much as from the new religion? Or was it to become what its cities, its merchants and its scholars increasingly wanted, a Muslim empire in full, governed under Islam, law, and joined without reservation to the wider Islamic world? Sunni Baru gave his answer quickly, and it was his undoing. The traditions record that the new king was called upon, publicly and repeatedly, to declare himself a submitting Muslim, and that he refused, standing instead with the soldiers and the traditional party of the countryside, who had been the backbone of his father's power. To the Muslim faction, this refusal was intolerable, and it was more than a matter of doctrine. The Muslim party included the merchants whose caravans and credit sustained the economy, the city elites of Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao itself, and the educated men who staffed what administration the empire had. They had endured Sunni Ali's rough hand because his power was unanswerable. They would not endure his sons. Their champion was ready, and he was formidable. Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, known as Muhammad Touré, was one of the greatest of Sunni Ali's generals and governors, a man in his middle years with a long record of command, deep connections through the army, and a reputation for devout and orthodox Islam. His family origins were later debated by the chroniclers, with most tracing his father to Soninke or Takru roots in the far west, while Songhai oral tradition made him the son of Sunni Ali's own sister, and thus the old king's nephew, a sister's son moving against the father's son, a drama as old as monarchy itself. Whatever his precise descent, Muhammad Touré was no outsider. He had risen inside the machine Sunni Ali built, and he understood better than anyone alive both its strength and the fault line running through its heart. The struggle between Sunni Baru and Muhammad Touré came to battle with remarkable speed. Within months of the old king's death, in April of 1493, the two forces met at a place called Anfao, near Gao, in one of the decisive battles of West African history. The fighting, the traditions say, was hard, for the old order did not yield tamely. But Muhammad Touré's veterans and his cause prevailed. Sunni Baru was defeated and fled the field, vanishing from the pages of history into exile in the southern country, and with him fell a dynasty and an era. Muhammad Touré entered Gao as master of the empire, and to seal the revolution he had made, he took a new royal title, one that no ruler had borne before, Askia. The chronicles preserve a story, perhaps a legend, perhaps a memory, about the origin of the word. telling that when the daughters of the old royal house heard that the usurper had claimed the throne, they cried out in scorn, "Askia, he shall not be it," and that Muhammad, with the confidence of a man who knew that history was now his to rule, took their very cry of protest and made it his crown name. True or not, the name endured. He would be remembered as Askia Muhammad, first of the Askia dynasty, and in time simply as Askia the Great, and the 35 years of his reign from 1493 to 1528 would carry Songhai to the summit of its power and glory. Askia Muhammad's position in his first months was more delicate than his victory suggested. He was, when all was said, a usurper. He did not descend from the Sunni line in the male descent that custom honored. He did not hold the ancient royal symbols of the Songhai, and the traditional party in the countryside regarded him as illegitimate. A lesser man might have tried to smother this weakness with terror. Askia Muhammad understood something deeper, that if the old sources of legitimacy were closed to him, he must open a new one, and that the new source was ready to hand. He would be legitimate not as heir of the river kings, but as a Muslim sovereign, ruling justly under God, recognized by the great authorities of the Islamic world. And so, once he had secured his throne, subdued the immediate resistance, and placed trusted men above all his able brother Umar, whom he made Karina Fari, governor of the vital western provinces. In the key commands, he announced his intention to do what only one Sudanic emperor before him had done in imperial style. He would make the pilgrimage to Mecca. The Hajj of Askia Muhammad, which occupied roughly 2 years from late 1496 to 1498, was one of the grandest religious and political spectacles of its age, and it was consciously designed to recall and to rival the legendary pilgrimage of Mansa Musa 170 years earlier. The Askia travelled with a great retinue of soldiers, courtiers and scholars, and he carried with him an immense treasure in gold, which the chronicles number at 300,000 pieces. A third of it, they record, he spent and gave away in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, in alms to the poor and gifts to the guardians of the sanctuaries. With another portion he purchased gardens in the holy cities, and endowed in Cairo a hostel, a permanent lodging for pilgrims from the lands of the Sudan, so that West Africans arriving after their desert crossing would forever find a roof and a welcome waiting for them, a work of practical piety that speaks touchingly across the centuries. The remainder paid the expenses of the road, and, no doubt, announced at every stage that the lord of the Niger lands was a monarch of consequence. Consider what such a journey actually asked of those who made it. The road from Gao to Mecca and back was a round trip of many thousands of kilometers, the better part of 2 years of travel, and nearly every stage of it was dangerous. The pilgrim caravan of the Askia went out across the desert by the eastern ways, through the country of Aya and the oases, and onward along the ancient pilgrim roads that gathered the faithful of all Africa toward Egypt. Roads where water, forage, and safety all had to be found afresh each day for a company of hundreds of men and their animals, and where the treasure the caravan carried made it a prize worth any raider's ambition. In Cairo, the West African pilgrims entered one of the wonders of the medieval world, a city vaster than anything the Sudan could show, seat of sultans and of the caliph, crowded with scholars, merchants, and travelers from 3 continents. And from Cairo, the pilgrim road ran on with the great annual caravan toward the holy cities of Arabia, down desert ways, trod them by the faithful for 8 centuries. At Mecca, the Askia performed the ancient rites of the pilgrimage among believers gathered from the whole earth, from Morocco to India and beyond. And a ruler who had known himself the greatest sovereign of his own world stood in the pilgrim's simple white garments as one worshipper among multitudes, an experience that pilgrim kings across the ages have described as the most humbling and the most exalting of their lives. Then the whole immense journey had to be made again, in reverse, home across a third of the world. That so many West Africans, kings, scholars, and ordinary believers alike made this journey generation after generation tells us something essential about the world of our story. The Niger lands were not at the edge of anywhere. In the minds of their own people, they were one province of a vast community of faith and learning, and its roads, however long, were their roads too. The rewards of the journey were everything he had hoped. In the East, Askia Muhammad was received with honor by scholars and princes. In Cairo, then, the most important city of the Islamic world, he was received by the Abbasid caliph who resided there under the protection of the Egyptian sultans. And from that caliph he obtained the recognition that transformed his standing. He was invested, the chronicles tell us, with the authority of caliph of the lands of the Sudan, honored as the lawful Islamic sovereign of West Africa. Whatever such a title meant in strict law, its meaning in politics was immense. The usurper of 1493 came home in 1498 as the anointed of the Islamic world, his legitimacy now beyond the reach of any grumbling about bloodlines. He came home too with something of even more lasting value, relationships and ideas. Along his route he had met and consulted jurists and theologians, and he continued the practice at home, corresponding with and welcoming learned men of North Africa. The most famous of these advisors was Muhammad al-Makhili, a fierce and famous scholar from Tlemcen in the Maghreb, to whom the Askia submitted long lists of questions on the duties of a ruler, the conduct of markets, the correction of abuses, the nature of lawful government, and whose written replies to the questions of Askia Muhammad became a celebrated treatise on Islamic statecraft, studied in West Africa for centuries afterward. Other scholars, among them the Egyptian polymath al-Suyuti, also corresponded with or advised the Songhai court. The empire of the Niger was now plugged directly into the intellectual currents of Cairo, Fez, and Mecca. One more monument of these years still stands, and it may be the most evocative of all. At Gao, around the year 1495, between his seizure of power and his departure for the East, Askia Muhammad raised a great structure of earth and timber, a towering stepped pyramid of mud brick bristling with wooden beams, which tradition has always called the Tomb of Askia. It rises 17 meters above the town, and it has been maintained, replastered by hand after each rainy season in the ancient way, for more than 500 years. In our own time it has been recognized by the world as a treasure of human heritage. Whether the great Askia truly lies within it, tradition affirms and archaeology cannot confirm, but as a statement in earth of what he intended, a monument joining the mud-building genius of the Sahel to the aspiration of a universal Islamic empire, it could not be clearer. The dynasty of the Askias, meant to be remembered, and it has been. Legitimacy secured, Askia Muhammad turned to the labor that would prove his true genius and his most enduring legacy, the organization of the empire. Sunni Ali had conquered a vast territory and sketched the outlines of a government, but the state he left was still, at bottom, an enormous war machine. held together by campaigning and by the terror of the royal name. Askia Muhammad set out to transform it into something that could outlive any individual ruler, an administered empire with offices and provinces, taxes and courts, standing forces and settled routines. In this work he showed a capacity that history grants far more rarely than battlefield brilliance, the patient, unglamorous talent for building institutions, and it is chiefly for this that later ages named him the Great. The framework of the imperial government, as it emerges from the chronicles, was a hierarchy radiating outward from the Askia himself, who ruled from Gao as sovereign lord of the whole. The empire was divided into provinces and regions, each under a governor appointed by the ruler and holding office at the ruler's pleasure. The grandest of these governorships was that of Kurmina, embracing the rich western lands upriver, whose holder bore the title Kurmina Fari and ranked as the second man of the empire, a post the Askia entrusted first to his loyal brother Umar, and which was often held thereafter by the heir or the most trusted prince. In the east, the province of Dendi, the old ancestral country downriver, had its own great governor, the Dendi Fari, guarding the empire's other flank. Beneath and beside these stood a constellation of offices whose very titles, preserved in the chronicles, let us hear the machinery of the state working. The High Khoi, admiral of the river fleet, master of the boats, one of the mightiest men of the realm. For the fleet remained the spine of imperial power. The Balama, a chief military commander stationed near Timbuktu. The Hari farmer, the official of the waters, overseeing fisheries and river resources. The Sao farmer, master of the forests. The Fari Mundia, charged with agriculture and the royal estates, officials of the treasury and of purchases, masters of the court's etiquette and of its correspondence. Over the great trading cities the Askia set governors, and where the towns were Muslim, judges. The Timbuktu Khoi and the Quadi of Timbuktu, the Jene Khoi and the Kadi of Jene, twin authorities of government and law. It would be too much to imagine this as a modern bureaucracy with filing cabinets and salaries paid on the first of the month. It was a court-centered government of the late medieval kind, run through great men, kinsmen and royal slaves bound to the sovereign. But by the standards of its age, on any continent it was an impressively articulated state, and the chronicles judged that nothing like it had been seen before in the lands of the Sudan. Two reforms in particular reveal the quality of the Askia's mind. The first concerned the army. Under Sunni Ali, the Songhai host had been raised largely by general levy. When the king marched, the countryside marched with him. Farmers and fishermen turned soldiers for the season. Askia Muhammad changed this. He established a standing professional army, full-time soldiers distinct from the mass of the population, together with the permanent river fleet under its admiral and a royal guard of cavalry and archers about his person. The change did two things at once. It gave the empire a disciplined, always ready instrument of war, and, just as important, it gave the farmer back his farm and the fisherman his nets. The chronicles observed the distinction with approval. Under the new order, the people of the land could cultivate and trade in peace while the soldiers soldiered. Fewer things mark the maturing of a state more clearly than that separation, and with it came the quiet revolution that contemporaries prized above all others: security. The roads and the river became safe. A merchant, the saying went, could travel alone through the breadth of the empire without fear, and whether or not the boast was ever perfectly true, that it could be made at all, tells us what Songhai under the Askias meant to the people who lived in it. Order, after centuries of raiding, an immense and precious peace. The second reform concerned the market. Askia Muhammad decreed uniform weights and measures throughout the empire, so that a measure of grain or a weight of gold meant the same thing in Jaina as in Gao, and he appointed inspectors of the markets in the great cities, officials charged with checking scales, honest dealing, and fair practice, an institution with deep roots in Islamic governance, doubtless among the fruits of his consultations with the jurists. Alongside these came the systematic ordering of the revenue, regular taxes assessed on the provinces, tribute from subject rulers, tolls on the caravans and the river traffic, levies on the salt of the desert and the gold of the south, and the yield of the royal estates, farms worked in great part by unfree labour and by settled communities of captives which fed the court and the army. A canal-fed agriculture flourished along the river. The chronicles speak too of works to support cultivation, and of a countryside so productive that the cities of the Niger, deep in the interior of Africa, could sustain populations that astonished travellers. None of this glittered like a victory in the field, and a listener may be forgiven if, drifting towards sleep, the details of tax assessment and market inspection blur gently together. But it was precisely this web of orderly, boring, dependable arrangements that turned conquest into civilization, and it was the deepest reason why the Songhai peace held together across 1,000,000 square kilometers. Trade, under such protection, surged. Gao in the Askia's time was a metropolis of the caravan world. The great markets received the salt of Takhaza, the copper and cloth and horses of the north, and sent back the gold, ivory, and produce of the south. Cola nuts moved north from the forests. Grain moved down the river in fleets of cargo canoes. Cowries jingled in the market baskets, and through everything ran the deep, steady pulse of the gold trade, now flowing through Songhai hands more completely than it had flowed through any hands before. The empire did not, for the most part, mine gold or cut salt itself. Its genius, like Ghana's and Mali's before it, was to command the crossroads, to tax, protect, and organize the exchange, and to take its wealth from the meeting of worlds. Around the year 1510, a young traveller, Romfez, a Moorish diplomat of Andalusian family, whom the world would later know as Leo Africanus, visited the cities of the Niger and left us the most vivid outsider's portrait of Songhai at its height. He described Gao as a great town of rich merchants, where the court of the king displayed splendid magnificence, where imported goods from the north sold at handsome prices, and where the wealth of the ruler was beyond easy telling. Of Timbuktu, he recorded a detail that has charmed readers ever since, and which we will come to shortly concerning the city's books. His pages, written for readers in Italy, carried the fame of the Niger cities into Renaissance Europe, where they would glow in the imagination for centuries. And what of the man at the center of it all? The chronicles allow us a few human glimpses of Askia Muhammad, the person, and they are worth gathering as we go. He was, by their account, a ruler of commanding presence and genuine piety, generous to scholars and holy men, attentive to the complaints of the humble, capable of both hard justice and calculated mercy. He loved order and detail. The lists of offices and regulations that fill the records of his reign are the fingerprints of a mind that thought in systems. He was also, and the chronicles are equally clear about this, a dynasty on the grand scale, the father of a very large family by many wives and concubines, with dozens of sons who would fill the offices of the empire, a household that was itself an instrument of government. Every mess, marriage, and alliance, every son a governor in waiting. In his person, the two currents of Songhai history that had battled at Anfao found a kind of settlement. He ruled as an orthodox Muslim sovereign, prayed publicly, honored the law, exalted the scholars, and yet he did not, because he could not, and likely did not wish to, remake the countryside by force. Beyond the cities, the old religion of the river and the ancestors lived on undisturbed in the villages. The spirit priests kept their shrines, and the Askia's government taxed and protected Muslim and non-Muslim alike. It was a pragmatic tolerance, born of realism about what a state of that age could do, and it gave the empire something invaluable: religious peace across a religiously divided land. Askia Muhammad was an organizer first, but he was a conqueror too, and under his standard, the borders of Songhai reached their greatest extent. His wars had a different flavor from Sunni Ali's, where the old king had fought to master the river. The Askia fought at the edges to secure the trade routes, to punish raiders, to gather tribute, and in some campaigns, under the banner of the faith itself. Among his first great wars, in the years around 1498 to 1502, was a campaign against the Mossi kingdom of Yatenga in the south, the hereditary enemy whose horsemen had so long menaced the riverlands. The chronicles present it as a jihad, formally proclaimed after the Mossi king, invited to accept Islam, consulted his ancestors, and refused. The war was hard and destructive, and though the Mossi were beaten in the field and their country ravaged, they were never annexed. They remained behind their southern half request. They were never annexed. Heri Herish, from her, from the wild, hairy spirit. They were never annexed. They remained behind their southern half request. Horizons, unconquered neighbors of the empire to the end. A reminder that even the greatest powers of the age had limits. Westward, the Askia's armies pressed against the remnants of Mali, pushing Songhai's frontier far up the river and toward the Senegal Valley, absorbing provinces that had once obeyed the Mansas. The old empire, shrunken but stubborn, lived on to the southwest, a shadow of the colossus it had been. Northward, the Askia reached out to grasp the desert itself. His forces took control of the salt mines of Taghaza, the treasure house of the northern trade, and in 1514 and 1515, he marched east and north on his most distant campaigns, against the Sultanate of Agadez in the mountains of Ayr, seizing that caravan crossroads and setting it under tribute, and against the Hausa country beyond. The Eastern Wars carried Songhai power into lands no Niger Empire had ruled before. E-traveler Leo Africanus, who journeyed through these regions in the aftermath, reported that the Askia had subdued famous Hausa cities, Katsina among them, and Gobir, and levied tribute upon the region. And on his testimony, generations of historians have painted the Songhai frontier as reaching deep into what is now northern Nigeria. Modern scholars read those claims with some care, noting that Songhai's grip on Hausaland was probably loose and brief, where it existed at all, a matter of raids, tribute, and overawed neighbors more than settled government. But even weighed cautiously, the picture is astonishing. From Tahaza in the deep Sahara to the borders of Yatenga, from the approaches of the Senegal to the mountains of Air, the writ of Gao now ran, in strength or in shadow, across the whole breadth of the Western Sudan. No West African state before it had ever been so large. None would be again. Before we enter the Golden Age itself, let us climb, in imagination, to some great height above Gao around the year 1515, and look slowly around the horizon at the world in which this empire lived. For no state exists alone, and the neighbors of Songhai were themselves remarkable powers with deep histories of their own. Look north first, into the shimmer of the desert. There, scattered across distances that swallow kingdoms, live the Tuareg, the veiled people of the sands, organized in proud confederations around the mountain refuges of the deep Sahara, the Adrar of the Ifaraz, the Air Massif, herders, guides, warriors, and traders, never conquered in their deep desert homes and never truly conquerable, whom the empire could only ever hold in a wary balance of tribute, alliance, and occasional war, and whose city of Agadez, under its sultans, the Askia had lately brought to acknowledge Songhai's supremacy. Beyond them, weeks further north, lie the lands of the Maghreb, Morocco and its neighbors, and beyond those the Mediterranean world, all of it connected to the Niger by the slender, vital threads of the caravan routes. Now turn east. There, beyond the empire's Dendi heartland, the horizon belongs to the Hausa, a world of walled city-states in what is now northern Nigeria. Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Gobir, and their sisters, each with its own king, its own farmers, and famous weavers, and dyers, and leatherworkers. Cities that had grown wealthy on their crafts and on the trade routes that passed among them, and that kept their own written chronicle traditions, rivals of one another always, tributaries of greater powers sometimes, and in these very years, feeling the weight of Songhai's eastward reach. And far beyond the Hausa, around the great lake called Chad, lies the empire of Borno, heir of ancient Kanem, ruled by the Saifawa dynasty, a royal line so old that it had already reigned for some 5 centuries when the Askia took his throne and would reign for 3 more after Songhai's story was done. One of the longest-lived dynasties in the history of the world, a Muslim empire of the central Sudan that corresponded with Cairo and Tripoli and regarded itself with justice as Songhai's peer. Between Gao and Borno there was distance, diplomacy, and the shared world of Islam. The 2 giants of the Sudan faced one another across the Hausa lands like 2 suns whose light overlapped. Turn south, and the country changes. Beyond the river bend rise the lands of the mossy kingdoms, Yatenga and its brothers in the basin of the Volta rivers. Horsemen and farmers organized under sacred kings, holders of one of West Africa's most enduring political traditions, unconquered by Songhai, and destined in fact to outlast every empire of the river, for mossy kings reigned at Ouagadougou into modern times. Beyond the mossy, the savannah slowly thickens toward the great forests, the world of the gold-bearing streams and the cola trees, of peoples whom the river empires knew mainly through the middlemen of the trade, and whose own kingdoms, rising and flourishing in the forest shadow, belonged to a different chapter of Africa's story. And note, far off at the very edge of this southern world, something new under the sun in these decades. On the ocean coast, weeks beyond the forests, ships from Portugal had begun to appear during the later 1400s, building their first fort on the Gold Coast in 1482 and buying gold at the seaside that had once travelled north across the desert. To the lords of the Niger in 1515 this was distant rumour, a curiosity of the coastal lands. The desert routes were full, the cities rich, the caravans as great as ever. But the listener may note it quietly in passing, as one notes a single cloud on a wide horizon. The world's trade routes were beginning very slowly to grow new branches, finally turn west up the river. There, the empire's own provinces stretch away toward the Senegal, absorbing lands that once obeyed Ghana and Mali. And beyond the Songhai frontier the old empire of Mali itself endures, shrunken to its Mandi heartlands in the southwest, still ruled by its Mansas, still proud, a lion grown old, no longer a rival, but not yet a memory, and destined to linger for generations more in its homeland hills. Between and around all these powers move the peoples who belonged to no single state and enriched them all, the Fulani herdsmen drifting with their cattle along the grazing lands from the Senegal to Hausaland, the Wangara merchants whose family networks laced the whole map together, the desert guides, the river boatmen, the wandering scholars and holy men. That was the world of which Songhai, in the reign of Askia Muhammad, was the acknowledged center. Not an empire alone in a wilderness, but the greatest power in a crowded, sophisticated, interconnected civilization of states, which stretched by way of desert, river, and savanna from the Atlantic to Lake Chad, and which the caravans bound to Cairo, Fez, and Mecca beyond. It is in these same years, the first quarter of the 1500s, that we should pause and simply look around, for this was the golden age of the Songhai Empire, the summit toward which our whole story has been climbing, and its light shone brightest in the city whose name still carries a glow of legend, Timbuktu. Timbuktu had begun humbly, tradition says, as a seasonal camp of Tuareg herders near a well kept by an old woman remembered as Buktu, from whom the place took its name, the Well of Buktu. Its fortune was its location, a short distance north of the Niger, at the very top of the river's bend, the natural port where the world of the camel met the world of the canoe. Goods coming south by caravan were unloaded at Timbuktu onto boats. Goods coming north by river were loaded there onto camels. Under Mali, the town had become a city. Under the Songhai peace, it became a phenomenon. Its population in the 16th century is honestly uncertain. The grandest traditional claims speak of 100,000 people, while careful modern historians suggest figures closer to 30 to 50,000. But even at the cautious estimate, Timbuktu stood among the great cities of the world of its day, larger than most European capitals of the same era. A maze of mud brick houses and busy markets around the towers of its three famous mosques: Jingwereber, the Friday Mosque of Mansa Musa's founding; Sidi Yahya, raised in the 1400s, and Sankore, in the Scholars' Quarter, whose name would become shorthand for the intellectual life of a continent. For Timbuktu's deepest fame was not its trade, but its learning. Around the Sankore Mosque and throughout the city there flourished, in the Songhai century, one of the great scholarly communities of the early modern world. It was not a university in the European sense, with a single campus and a chancellor. It was something older and looser, and in its way more remarkable, a constellation of independent scholars, each teaching in his home or at the mosque, each granting his own students license to teach in turn, the whole bound together by chains of learning that reached back through Fez and Cairo to the classical heart of Islamic civilization. Students came by the hundreds and eventually the thousands from across the Sudan and beyond, beginning as children with the memorization of the Quran in the city's many elementary schools. Tradition counts such schools in the dozens and dozens and ascending, if they had the gift, through grammar and rhetoric, law and theology, logic, astronomy, mathematics and medicine. The great scholarly families of the city, above all the Akit family, of Berber origin and generations deep in learning, produced jurists whose opinions were sought from distant lands. The city's judges, the Qadis of Timbuktu, held an authority that even emperors treated with respect. The chronicles delight in stories of Qadis who scolded the mighty Askia himself and were honored for it. For in Timbuktu, the men of the law liked to say, learning stood above power, and learning had a marketplace. Books in Timbuktu were treasure. Every volume was copied by hand, by professional scribes whose labor took weeks or months, on paper imported across the desert at great cost, and a fine manuscript, a law book, a Quran, a treatise on astronomy, could be worth more than gold of the same weight. Leo Africanus, visiting around 1510, recorded the detail that has echoed ever since, that in Timbuktu manuscript books from the Barbary coast were sold, and that more profit was made from this trade in books than from any other line of merchandise in the city. Think of that. In this city at the edge of the Sahara, 500 years ago, the single most profitable business was not salt, not cloth, not even gold, but books. Scholars built private libraries of hundreds and sometimes thousands of volumes, lent and borrowed and copied and annotated and wrote works of their own, chronicles, legal opinions, poetry, commentaries, works on medicine and mathematics and the movement of the stars. And here is the wonder that lets us end this part of the story with a smile. Those books survive. Hundreds of thousands of manuscript pages from Timbuktu and the river cities, some from this very golden age, many copied and recopied in the centuries after, have been preserved by the families of the city, handed down, hidden in chests and cellars through every danger, and they exist today, studied by scholars, digitized page by fragile page, the living proof in ink and paper that the age we are describing tonight was real. The golden age of Timbuktu is not a fable. You can read its handwriting to feel what this world of learning meant in a single human life. Follow, in imagination, one boy of the Songhai century through it. He is born, let us say, in a river town below Gao, the son of a trading family, and at 6 or 7 years old, he is sent to the neighborhood Quran school, where he sits with the other children in the shade of a wall, each with a wooden writing board on his knees, copying the sacred verses in ink that can be washed away and written again, reciting in chorus, morning after morning, year after year, until the whole of the holy book lives in his memory, which was the foundation of all learning and remained, for most, its summit as well. But this boy has the gift, and his teacher says so, and so at 14 or 15 he is sent, with letters of introduction and his father's hopes, upriver to Timbuktu. There he does not enroll in anything, for there is nothing to enroll in. Instead, he seeks out a master, a scholar of reputation, and asks to read with him. And if he is accepted, his real education begins. Grammar first, the architecture of the Arabic language, then rhetoric and literature, then the law, book by book, each text read aloud with the master, commented, memorized, disputed, until the master is satisfied and grants him his ijazah, his license, a written testimony that this student has truly mastered this book under this teacher, who had it from his own teacher, in a chain of names reaching back, teacher by teacher, toward the great scholars of Cairo and Fez, and ultimately the founders of the science itself. Our student collects such licenses as a merchant collects trading partners, moving from master to master, perhaps hearing law from one of the Arkit family, logic from a sheikh lately come from the East, astronomy from a specialist who can calculate the prayer times and the direction of Mecca. He supports himself as students there did, perhaps copying manuscripts for pay, his fine hand earning his supper in the city where books were the best business of all. And in time, 20 years on, he is himself a master with students at his feet, or a Qadi in a river town dispensing the law, or the learned secretary of a governor, and his name, if he is fortunate, will be remembered in the biographical registers that Timbuktu's scholars kept of their own, registers in which hundreds of such lives are recorded and which survive to this day. Multiply that one life by thousands across a century and a half, and you have the University of Timbuktu, not a building, but an unbroken golden chain of human minds. Jenne, the southern sister, shone almost as brightly, a city of scholars and merchants in the green world of the inland delta, famous then as now for the great mud-built mosque at its heart, and for a prosperity founded on the meeting of forest and river trade. The chronicler Al-Sadi, who knew it well, praised it as one of the great markets of the Muslim world, blessed and flourishing, the city where the caravans of salt met the gold of the south. And Gao, the capital, largest of them all, spread along the river bank with its palaces and its harbour crowded with canoes, the seat of the court, the treasury, and the great officers of state, the political heart of the Sudan. Between and beyond them, along 2,000 kilometers of river, lay the working body of the empire, the port towns and Median carriers. Of river lay the working body of the empire, the port towns and Median carriers, Arkit villages, the rice lands and millet fields, the herds moving to seasonal pasture, the fishing fleets of the Sorko on the evening water, the whole vast, quiet, productive world that the chronicles rarely pause to describe, because it was simply life going on in safety under the Songhai peace. At the center of it all, in Gao, revolved the imperial court, and the court deserves a moment of its own, for it was at once a government, a theatre, and a school of power. The travellers and the chronicles let us sketch its outlines. The Askia held audience surrounded by his great officers in order of rank, and the etiquette of approaching a Sudanic emperor was of a solemnity that startled foreign visitors. Petitioners and even great dignitaries humbled themselves low before the sovereign in the region's ancient royal manner, sprinkling dust upon their heads as they addressed him, a custom that travellers had described at the courts of these lands since the days of Mali. Around the ruler stood the visible apparatus of majesty, the royal guard of cavalry and archers, the state horses in their rich harness, the drums and trumpets whose sounding marked the rhythms of the palace day, just as a drum had marked the king's meal in al-Bakri's Gao 5 centuries before. For court ceremony is among the most conservative of all human arts. and the Askias inherited and elaborated rituals whose roots lay deep in the age of the Tsar Leo Africanus, who saw the court in its glory around 1510, wrote of the great state kept by the ruler, of a palace splendidly appointed, of plates and sceptres of gold, of such weight that he took care to record it, and of the crowds of ambassadors, officers and suitors that filled the royal town. He noticed, too, with a merchant's eye, what such a court meant for business, the endless demand for fine cloth, for horses, for swords and European wares, all of which sold at Gao for handsome prices, the luxury trade of an imperial capital. But the court was not only spectacle, it was the working heart of the administration we have described, the place where the provincial governors came to render account and renew their loyalty, where disputes between great men were judged, where the correspondence of the empire conducted in Arabic by trained secretaries was written and sealed, and where the next generation of rulers was formed. The sons of the Askia and the sons of governors and vassal kings grew up together in the royal household, learning war, law and manners, and learning, too, to know one another, a schooling that bound the far provinces to the center through friendships and rivalries that would last a lifetime. Judges and scholars attended the sovereign, and the chronicles record with approval that the great Askias ought their counsel deferred to the law in his public conduct, and showered the learned with gifts, pensions, and honors and lands. Petitions rose to the court from astonishing distances, and pilgrims, envoys, and holy men from across the Sudan and the desert made Gao a crossroads of comings and goings. If a listener wishes a single image of the empire at its height, let it be this one. The audience hall at Gao on a morning of state, the officers ranked in their robes, the dust-covered messenger from a province 40 days' travel away kneeling to deliver his news, the scribes writing, the drums at the door, and at the center, on the high seat, an old, formidable, pious man who had taken a throne by force and then spent 3 decades teaching a third of West Africa to live by rules. Let us drift for a moment down into that world, away from kings and dates, and imagine a single evening in the empire at its height, somewhere along the river between Gao and Timbuktu, around the year 1515. The sun is going down across the water, and the heat of the day is loosening its grip. A caravan that left the salt mines weeks ago is making camp within sight of the river at last, the camels groaning as they kneel, the slabs of salt, grey-white and heavy as doors, stacked carefully upright in the sand. Down at the shore, the fishing canoes are coming in, and the smell of wood smoke and frying fish drifts up between the houses. In the market square, the last traders are weighing out grain with the standard measures the Askia's inspectors have approved, and a merchant from Jenny is counting cowries into the hand of a boat captain who will carry his cloth upriver on the morning current. From the mosque, the call to the sunset prayer rises, and some of the townsfolk turn toward it while others, farming people in from the villages, pour a little milk by the doorpost for the spirits of their grandmothers, and no one finds the difference worth a quarrel. Somewhere, a griot is tuning his instrument and beginning, for the 100th time, the story of Ali Bear, the sorcerer king, who was never defeated, and the children settle at his feet. The river slides past in the dusk, carrying the empire's wealth and the empire's news, at the speed of the current as it has for 1,000 years. This, as much as any battle or any decree, is what the rise of Songhai meant. Thousands of evenings like this one, secure and ordinary, from the desert to the forest's edge. If we could walk through that world in daylight, we would find a society arranged in patterns that the chronicles and travelers allow us to reconstruct in some detail. Songhai society, like most societies of its age on every continent, was a hierarchy, and a person's place in it was largely given at birth through family, clan, and occupation. At the summit stood the imperial family and the great nobility, the descendants of the old Songhai lineages and the families of generals and governors, who monopolized the high offices and the command of troops. Around them moved the class that gave the cities their color and their wealth, the merchants from great caravan financiers whose partnerships stretched from Fez to the forest edge, down to the shopkeepers and brokers of the market squares, together with the scholars and judges who formed an aristocracy of learning that intermarried with commerce and stood in the cities, nearly level with the nobility of the sword. Below them, and forming the great majority of all the empire's people, lived the farmers, herders, and fishing folk of the countryside, free men and women, whose taxes and harvests carried the whole structure on their shoulders. Among the free population, many crafts were organized in the manner so characteristic of the Western Sudan as hereditary occupational groups. Castes is the word historians often use. Families of blacksmiths, of leather workers, of potters, of weavers, of boat builders, and of griots, the bards and genealogists, each guarding the secrets and the pride of their calling, each marrying largely within it. The blacksmiths in particular held a special and ambiguous power, for the man who could master fire and iron, who forged the hoe and the spearhead alike, was felt to stand close to dangerous spiritual forces, and smiths were often feared, respected, and set apart all at once. And beneath the whole order, sustaining far more of it than the palaces liked to acknowledge, were the unfree, enslaved people, captives of the empire's wars and the raiding of its frontiers, and their descendants. Some served in households, some in the army, and some rose paradoxically to genuine power. For kings often trusted slaves precisely because they had no family ambitions, and certain high offices of the court were filled by them. But the many labored in the fields, above all on the royal and noble estates along the river, whose grain fed the court and the army, and many others were sold northward across the desert into the long sorrow of the trans-Saharan slave trade. It is a hard truth, and we say it plainly and without flinching, as we would of Rome or of any other empire of the age. The brilliance of the Songhai peace was real, and it rested in part on unfree shoulders. History owes those uncounted people at least the honesty of remembering that they were there. Women's lives in the empire ran along lines that varied greatly between city and countryside and between faiths. In the towns, Islamic norms increasingly shaped law and custom in marriage, inheritance, and public life. In the villages of the old religion, older patterns held, and travelers from the strict north were sometimes startled by the freedom and social ease of Sudanic women. At the summit of society, royal women were figures of genuine consequence. Queen mothers and royal sisters carried weight in questions of succession and alliance. Princesses were married to seal the loyalty of governors and vassal kings, and tradition remembers individual royal women as founders and namers of towns, beginning with Timbuktu of the well herself. And in the spiritual life of the countryside, women stood at the very center as priestesses and mediums of the river spirits, keepers of cults that were already ancient when the first Tsar king ruled, and that would long outlive the empire. The daily rhythm of this world was set by the river and the seasons, the rains and the sowing, the rising flood and the great fishing, the harvest, the dry season when the caravans moved and the armies marched. Its food was the food the land still gives: rice and millet and sorghum, river fish fresh and smoked, milk and butter from the herds, dates from the desert gardens. Its music was the music of the griots, lute and drum and the praise songs of kings. Its evenings were storytelling and the endless genealogies by which every family knew its place in time. It was, in short, a whole civilization, complete and self-assured, neither a paradise nor a horror, but a great human world in working order. And at its height, in the reign of Askia Muhammad, it had every reason to believe itself the equal of any state under heaven. The Islamic learning of the cities gave that self-assurance a voice, and nowhere is it captured better than in a phrase from the chronicles concerning Timbuktu's proudest claim. The city's scholars liked to say that of all the routes of trade, the salt from the mines of the north and the gold from the lands of the south, none brought Timbuktu greater honor than the third stream of its wealth, the books and the learning, the word of God and the wisdom of men, coming from the heart of the Islamic world and now flowing back out of Africa in the writings of its own sages. In the great days of the Askia, that was no idle boast. West African scholars of the Songhai era were read and respected in Morocco and in Egypt. Students traveled to the Niger as well as from it, and the region's own historical consciousness, which would flower in the 17th century in the great chronicles we have leaned on all evening. The Tarikh al-Sudan and the Tarikh al-Fatash was formed in the schools of this golden age. When we recount this history at all, we are, in the most direct way, harvesting the fruit of Songhai's own scholarship, hearing the empire remember itself. Perhaps you have wondered, as we have travelled together through these centuries, how it is that we can know so much about a world so distant. And it is worth taking a quiet moment before our story closes to name the witnesses, because the answer is one of the glories of African history. We know the rise of Songhai from 4 great streams of evidence, and they check and correct one another like the accounts of 4 honest friends. The first stream is the writing of outsiders, the Arab geographers, Al-Yaqubi in the 9th century, Al-Muhallabi in the 10th, Al-Bakri in the 11th, patiently interviewing merchants who had made the crossing. The incomparable Ibn Battuta, who saw Gao with his own eyes in 1353. The historian Ibn Khaldun, who gathered the traditions of Mali in 14th century North Africa, and Leo Africanus, who walked the streets of Timbuktu and Gao at the very height of the Askia's power and described what he saw for the readers of Renaissance Europe. The second stream flows from West Africa itself. The great chronicles of Timbuktu, above all the Tarikh al-Sudan of Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, and the chronicle tradition known as the Tarikh al-Fatash, written in Arabic by Songhai world scholars in the 1600s, men whose grandfathers had lived under the empire, drawing on older documents, court records, and the memories of the learned families. Whatever their loyalties and grudges, and they had both, they preserved the names, the dates, the offices, and the human stories on which every modern history of Songhai is built. The third stream never needed ink at all. The oral tradition, the epics of the griots, handed from master to apprentice across 5 centuries, which kept alive the people's own memory of their kings, above all of Ali Bear, the unconquerable, and which scholars today record and study as a historical source in its own right. And the fourth stream is the earth itself, the archaeology of Gao and Gao Sanay and Old Jene, the royal tombstones of Spanish marble with their carved names and dates, the imported beads and glass and brick that trace the trade routes as surely as any ledger, and the hundreds of thousands of surviving manuscript pages of Timbuktu. Where these four witnesses agree, and on the great outlines of tonight's story they agree remarkably well, we may trust that we are hearing, across 500 years, something close to the truth. And where they disagree or fall silent on a date here, a number there, honest history says so plainly as we have tried to do tonight. Few chapters of the human past, outside the most famous empires of Europe and Asia, are so richly and so multiply attested. The rise of Songhai is not legend embroidered on emptiness. It is documented history, African history, written, carved, remembered, and dug from the ground. And so we come, gently, to the closing years of the great reign, and to the end of our story tonight, for every ascent has a summit, and the summit of Songhai was reached in the last decades of Askia Muhammad's rule, in the 1510s and 1520s, when the empire stood complete. The river secure from Dendi to the western provinces, the desert ports and the salt mines obedient, the caravans moving under protection, the cities luminous with wealth and learning, the treasury full, the army unmatched, and the name of the Askia honored, quite literally, from the Atlantic approaches to the holy cities of Arabia. The chronicles, looking back on this age from a later and sadder time, remembered it simply as the good time, the time of order, when the word of the law ran along the river and a traveller feared nothing on the road. The great emperor himself, however, was mortal, and time now did to him what no enemy had managed. Askia Muhammad had been a mature man, a veteran general, when he took the throne in 1493. By the 1520s he was old, past 80 by the reckonings of the chroniclers, and his eyes were failing toward blindness, a condition his closest attendants at first concealed from the court. Around the aging sovereign, inevitably, the next generation began to stir. He had raised his many sons to power as the governors and generals of the empire, and they had grown into exactly what he had made them, ambitious commanders with armies at their backs, watching their father fade and one another maneuver. His beloved brother Umar, the Kurminafari, the loyal second self of his great years, had died in 1519, and with him went the strongest pillar of the old order. The court thickened with faction. The emperor, blind and increasingly isolated, leaned on a trusted servant and chamberlain, Ali Folan, whose influence the princes resented, and the oldest and boldest of the sons, Musa, at last ran out of patience. In August of 1528, after 35 years on the throne, Askia Muhammad the Great was confronted by his son and compelled to abdicate. There was no great battle and no bloodbath at the moment of the fall itself. The old man's power had simply, quietly completed its passage into other hands. Musa took the throne and the title, and the founder of the dynasty passed into an enforced retirement, kept at first about the palace at Gao and later exiled to an island in the Niger, a quiet place amid the moving water, within sound, we may imagine, of the fishermen's evening voices, on the river where his people's whole story had begun. He lived on for nearly 10 years more, blind and very old, while the empire he had built continued its vast daily life around him. The caravans arriving, the fleets passing on the current, the scholars teaching in Timbuktu, the tax registers filling in the offices he had created. In his last years, one of his younger sons, Ishmael, having risen in his turn to the throne, brought the old man back from the island to Gao to live out his days in honor in the royal city. And there, in the year 1538, in extreme old age, having seen nearly a century, Askia Muhammad the Great died in peace. Tradition lays him to rest in the great earthen monument he had raised at Gao more than 40 years before. The stepped pyramid that still stands above the town, still tended by hand, 5 centuries later. The tomb of the Askia. Consider, as sleep comes near, the full arc of what we have witnessed tonight. A river that turns away from the sea and carries life to the desert's edge. Fishermen and hunters and farmers blending over quiet centuries into a people. A town at the crossroads of salt and gold, growing patient and rich. A line of kings carved into Spanish marble under the Sahel sky. Long generations in the shadow of Ghana and Mali, and a prince's escape that planted the seed of freedom. A sorcerer king who made the river a weapon and gathered all its cities into one hand. And a pilgrim emperor who turned conquest into order, order into prosperity, and prosperity into a golden age of cities and books. An empire of more than 1 million square kilometers, the largest that West Africa in all its long history has ever known. In the year 1528, as the old Askia laid down his power, that empire stood at the very height of its strength, and to every observer from Fez to Cairo it must have seemed a permanent feature of the earth, as fixed as the river itself. What time would eventually make of that greatness, how the Golden Age would meet its own tests and trials, is another story for another night. Tonight we leave the Songhai Empire where it deserves to be left, at its zenith. The caravans coming in from the desert under the evening star, the canoes riding home on the current, the lamps of the scholars burning late over their manuscripts in Timbuktu, and the great river, the giver of everything, flowing on quietly in the dark, past Gao and its sleeping palaces, carrying the wealth and the dreams of the greatest empire West Africa ever knew. Sleep well.